staying with a subject that is dear to our hearts, so John, I have a question for you. Bermudians with non-Bermudian spouses and PRCs are potential sources of foreign capital, if you fit that into your model. Do the ownership restrictions on real estate and license fees they currently face meet the needs of today's economy? If not, what recommended changes would you suggest?
Well, first of all, we should recognize that we're all human beings. And if a Bermudian is married to a foreigner, they should not be discriminated as a result of that marriage. Whether that, if our law allows them to get married, allows them to stay in Bermuda, we should not be saying to them, well, you're Bermudian, but you're no longer a Bermudian that has the rights of and what's worse is that even if the person wants to put the property in their own name, they say, no, you can't do that unless you get permission to own a property, and government has to give you permission. So that is against the Human Rights Act, if you want to look at it from a point of view. The Human Rights Act says that you should not discriminate as a result of origins, color, creed, and aspects. So it's contradiction. And I suspect that anybody who took it to court and it got as far as the British court, they would laugh at it. We've got a policy in place that makes no sense. So we should, and that's part of our problem. The policies that don't work, that make an ass of Bermuda, should be eliminated quickly, as we quickly eliminated the pot washing issue. We should just get rid of some of these things.
Okay, Mr. Kopp, let's talk about those Bermudians who actually were fortunate in the first instance to own property. With the declining employment in international business and its related knock-on effects, are there signs that Bermudians are having difficulty in servicing mortgages on both primary residences and investment properties? If so, how have the banks responded?
Thank you, buddy. Obviously, that's a hot question around, and I think it's something like the Mark Twain quote, where the reports of my death are highly exaggerated, and everybody's talking about the problems in the credit world for the banks, but quite frankly, the credit has held up surprisingly well. Obviously, there's some strains, and people are talking most about single-family mortgages, but throughout this period, people were paying down their mortgages because often the payment had a principal component, so the payments came down. A lot of these mortgages were made over the years. So I think the credit portfolios have held up much better than people will give it credit to. And of course, the banks are better prepared. They're better reserved. They have more capital. And loans in Bermuda only half the average bank's balance sheet, unlike America or London, wherever the loans would be over 100% of deposit. So I think the banks are pretty well prepared for it. There's a lot of counseling going on. I know all the banks are working with lenders. We have very few foreclosures going on at Butterfield. We're working through with the lenders and coming up with accommodations. So we're feeling guardedly positive.
Mr. Simmons, do you think the Bermudian debt situation could lead to a housing crisis or a debt crisis? You mentioned it in your
Yes,
introduction.
So the housing crisis leading to a banking crisis?
Debt crisis.
A debt crisis? No. No. Based on the numbers that I've seen, the lending by banks has decreased marginally, if at all. And that, I think, is perhaps the major determinant of whether or not there's a banking crisis, a housing crisis. Banks have a very important role to play in the recovery. Having said that, most of the banks have already overextended themselves. We need to go back to life in Bermuda in 07 and 06 and 05. And I would argue that that was not a healthy time. The amount of lending, the growth in lending since 2004 was consistently in the double digits. And I don't know that we want to get back to that place, because that leads to asset bubbles. And when asset bubbles burst, bad things happen. But to come back to your question, I think the banks have hopefully learned from the last recession when they unnecessarily cut off recession. So they're keeping it going. It would be great if they could increase it further, but of course there are significant risks to doing so.
If I could just chime in on this one here, because I'd like to, because my military background says, when I look at something, I ask the question, what exactly is going on here? If I look at what exactly is going on in Bermuda, I do see a housing crisis that's going to be as bad as about the US subprime crisis, because there's an avalanche of housing that's hanging out there. The South Side units down at the South Side have been built. The 4 towers are complete. They're not occupied. They're only half occupied. Gilbert Lopes over in South Shore is building 125 units to add to it. That's supposed to be affordable housing. There are no buyers for those housing. With the population decline, remember that from 68,000 down to 62,000 in this year, there's been a loss of resident population. There are therefore a lot more apartments empty. Bermuda today is probably sitting on about 3,000 unused apartments. People can carry it out of savings and their reserves, but that doesn't last forever. And there are still houses coming onto the market. There are still houses looking for buyers, and especially houses that are just being built. This kind of thing is what I see. It is real, but it is not talked about. And that's the point that Sir John and I have often made. Let's look at what's really happening, ask the question, what exactly is going on, and then look for that answer and verify it. And the verification is in those units over there, the unused units on the south side, and the fact that there's probably anywhere between 1,500 to 1,800 apartments and houses that have emptied since 2008.
Thank you.
We have a crisis.
Thank you. I'd like to just take a moment. If any of you have questions, can you please, on your cards, can you please raise your hand and they'll be collected? Not yet. Not yet.
The other thing is, every time you lose a foreigner, think about it, a foreign worker, he's renting he or she is renting somewhere. What do you lose? You lose the foreign exchange that they pay for the rent, that pays the Bermudian, that then pays the service, whether it's kids' education or what.
Maybe you could answer this question then. A lot of people are confused when they hear in the media that international business is leaving, but also hear that in 2011, 64 new insurance companies incorporated in Bermuda. Please explain if this means that overall international business is expanding, shrinking, or staying the same.
Well, again, the government does not put out information enough for us to make an empirical judgment on what's taking place. But from what we can gather, most of those companies were were purpose companies, they called them. They were, whether they were sidecars to deal with a particular toxic position that the insurance company might have had, or but maybe one or two of them. And even if they were one or two or three of them, even if they got started in Bermuda because they raised the capital, but one of the things that happens is they go and they create the company, and then they go looking for the capital. And it takes a long time to build an insurance operation up. But so we're not talking about any real significant growth. But every day you hear, and almost every other day you hear, of some company reducing the size of the staff. And a part of them are Bermudians who are no longer earning, and part of them are foreigners who are no longer paying their rent and buying cars and getting the service. And that drives our GDP south. And so, do we have growth in the international business? Or the financial service business? And Brett Kopp is probably better geared in terms of what he sees things than I am. But my suspicion is that we are seeing a negative decline because if 95% of your GDP is financial services, and if your GDP is falling, it has to fall from financial services.
Well, funny you should mention that, because I have a question for Mr. Kopp. Most people would agree that tourism, while greatly diminished in relative importance to the economy, is still critical in that it provides jobs as well as some of the basic infrastructure that international business needs, that is airlift, hotels, restaurants. The banks have all taken write-downs on many of their hotel loans in the past few years. To revitalize tourism will take a significant amount of capital from local banks. What role will the banks and other local financial institutions play to help maintain and revitalize our tourism infrastructure?
That's a tough one. I know I've heard Larry and Sir John speak about how tourism is dead, perhaps, and may not be as important, but I don't think we should be giving up on it. So I do think it's an industry we need to focus on. I don't think the local banks are going to be that helpful given the capital and the risks. I would like to see some effort, though, to figure out how we build a new hotel in the short term, because I think it could send a good message. And how can the government put a package of incentives together to make that happen through payroll tax reductions or import duties, or even using gambling as an incentive to get a new hotel. Because I do think we have to keep tourism going to some degree. We can't give up on it. It does create jobs. It does support local business. So I believe it is an industry we can't give up on, but I don't see the local banks providing all the capital. Some of it's going to have to come from abroad.
I have a question, an open question for the panel, so please jump in if you wish to answer. The government has recently floated the idea that increasing duties for all imported personal items to 35% across the board. On clothing, for example, this represents a 500% increase. Please share your thoughts on how this will affect working Bermudians and what it will do to the Bermuda economy.
I'll jump in there. We've got to distinguish between short-term solutions versus long-term solutions. The customs duty is narrow, to put it nicely. We need to broaden the tax base. Of course, now is probably not the time to do it, but we're trying to get more and more out of a rather narrow base. And of course, you're going to piss people off because the rates of duty are going to have to go up, and it's not clear that the amount collected will go up. We really need to grow up and develop a value-added tax. Some call it a sales tax, but value-added tax is better. A value-added tax would broaden the base to include services. So if you're going out for a meal, you will pay value-added tax on that. In fact, I mean, just about everything should be subject to value-added. And the good thing about that is that the rate of tax across the board could be rather low. I mean, right now we're toying with the possibility of 35% duties or 25% duties. Now, I haven't done the arithmetic, but it seems to me we're talking no more than, say, a 15% value added, possibly as low as 10, if the net is cast broad. So, I mean, I think I've heard enough of the nickeling and diming about duties. My view on the duty is that make it simple, make it consistent. Don't have exceptions for Peter and some for Paul. Consistency and simplicity and transparency, I think, are most important in any tax code.
I think I'd like to jump in on that one there because it's an interesting one. It's one I've looked at often. We set our customs duty and all that sort of stuff back when Queen Victoria was on the throne. Back in 1980, when tourism was still king, the income from tourism that year was around 325 million, I think. Government expenditure in that year was around 120 million. So by taxing the tourists who are coming here in the hundreds of thousands, made sense. That changed. In 1994 and going forward, it's completely different. The people who are here now are spending completely differently, and yet we're still trying to tax the consumption of goods on the island. It's stupid. It's crazy. We're trying to extract $200 million from a thing that is producing far less money now than it was, relatively speaking, in 1980. Craig's idea of a value-added tax is right. Tax transactions, not items that cross into our borders. So we've got to think along those lines. We've got to get out of Queen Victoria's reign and get ready for King Charles III.
Thank you. We have all the questions here, but since no one has filled in the cards, is there anyone who would like to give a question from the floor? Yes, please. Oh.
Would you like the mic? This gentleman here from the bank.
Yes.
Can you tell
Mr.
us
Kopp.
why in February 2011, why all three banks increased their interest rate?
It's a good question. Well, we did not increase our interest rate in February 11, let me tell you. The other two banks did. An ad for Butterfield. But let me say that the cost of doing business has escalated dramatically. You talked about those loan losses. Someone has to pay for those loan losses. Someone has to pay for the 10 people the banks have servicing problem loans. So the profitability of the mortgage business has dropped. It has not gone up.
Thank you. Question from the floor here. What opportunity, sorry. Steve?
Can I ask, actually, since that was my question, many might figure that out, that Sir John could address the question about the duty, the import duties, the 35% as well? I'd be interested to hear your views. Thank you.
That's Bill Thompson, somebody. Mr. Delivery. I believe that Adam Smith's philosophy was free market economy. And Bermuda, somehow or the other, in its mercantilism, produced somewhat of a free market economy, except for the fact that our forefathers decided that they're going to keep business out of Bermuda by 60-40. And what we're doing now is we're saying we're going to keep overseas business out of Bermuda by imposing a disproportionate tax on people entering our ports and harass them when they arrive to make sure you collect the tax. So what we're doing basically is, I don't want to use the word, but get a lot of people off by making them feel as though they are being interrogated every time they come to Bermuda. So, and because the amount now is so high, you're going, if it were 10%, oh well, we can let it slide. But 35%, no way we can let, we need the money. And you civil servants go down and harass people to make sure you collect it. And I think we've got it all wrong. We've turned this country upside down by not being progressive in our approach, in laying out economic programs that fit in more with what the rest of the world is doing. Because if the foreigner coming to Bermuda, and Bermudian too, sees something that looks so ridiculous, they say, well, what's this third world country? All they want to do is, when you go into a third world country, they hassle you for something they put in their own pockets. Well, they're not putting it in their own pockets, but what they're doing, they're putting it into a government's pocket by taking an excessive amount of money. So we need to change. And on the second part of this program, when we talk about opening up Bermuda, we need to make it comfortable and people, if people chose to go on the internet, find what they want, it fits them, it's current, it makes them attractive, and so forth, and they can get it at a cheaper price. Why should it be told they can't have it at a cheaper price through taxation? It makes no sense.
And on that note, we're going to start the second session. Oh, one more? Bruce?
Mr. Chairman, one of the threats or risks that hasn't been mentioned, I think, is us Bermudians ourselves. I think one of the big issues facing this country is that we as Bermudians are just not getting it. I just don't think we're getting it. I think many of us are like ostriches. We've got our heads in the sand. We're believing our own mantra. Bermuda's another world. Things have always worked out. They're always going to work out. And I think as long as we have that outlook, we're going to be in a state of gridlock. And I wish, in a way, that people would wake up and understand that it's their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, and their great-great that are going to be paying the taxes to service all this debt. Thank you.
I think Sir John referenced that when he mentioned the word entitlement. I think that's exactly it. So with that, I'm going to introduce to you the moderator for Bermuda and its future. Nathan Kowalski is the CFO and Senior Portfolio Manager at Anchor Investment Management. Previously, he worked in Canada at KPMG and Deloitte, where he provided mergers and acquisitions advice to corporate clients. Mr. Klaus, Nathan, is a chartered accountant, chartered financial analyst, and chartered investment manager. He's also author of the weekly Royal Gazette column. You've got some competition there, Mr. Burchell. Financial Ramblings from the Rock. Nathan.
Thanks, buddy. I wish my wife was here. She's never going to believe I've been this quiet for this long sitting here. But you can put the razor blades away. We're going to go look for solutions now. And we'll get maybe on some positive notes of the way forward. So the lead-off question for you gentlemen. In your opinion, what are the three major solutions or priorities that Bermuda must undertake immediately and in the medium and long term that will ensure the continued prosperity of Bermuda?
I led off in the first section. I'll lead up again in this second section. I think the immediate priority is to get Bermudans to understand that the game has changed. Tourism Bermuda is dead. Business Bermuda is here, and it isn't going to go away. You're not going to get back to tourism. We have, though, to get Bermudans to be as involved and as supportive of business Bermuda as it was of tourist Bermuda. That requires a huge psychological shift. It is going to be done against the racial legacy of the past and the present. It's a matter that has to be addressed because as long as we stay arguing about the past, we are going to continue sending off the most god-awful vibes to the business Bermuda community that we want to come here. They are far more affected by what's happening here because they're here 365 days a year. Under the old regime, tourists came, we smiled for 5 days, they went back home. Another one came, and we kept that up. The people who come here now come and stay for 360 days, they see our secrets, they see the underside of life, and we have to adjust. We, Bermudians, have to do some thinking, and government has got to lead on that. That's the immediate problem. The midterm is that and it's almost the same, that we've got to take a look at our education system. A quick aside here, Bermuda, believe it or not, is spending, when you look at public and private education put together, we're spending close to $200 million a year on educating a mere 10,000 students. That's a stupidly high expense for this island. The public system is around 120, the private system running parallel is 60. We can't really afford that nationally. Part of our cost structure has got to be taken down. But we've got to educate Bermuda to the point where they can have better job opportunities, but then we hit this entitlement problem. It's real. It won't go away. That's the midterm problem, but trending to the long term is that we have to re-invite global businesses to come to Bermuda, to set up in Bermuda and sell their services overseas. Bermudians can do it too, but a lot of the businesses do require high capital startups. Therefore, if Bermudians can amass $100 million and start their own insurance company, do it. If you can't, invite somebody else in who can. That's the stark reality. We can do that by easing some immigration and residency requirements, which has already started, we're pleased to see, in government. But we've got to get our resident population to grow. We've got to judiciously relax ownership rules in order to encourage the reinvestment of capital in Bermuda. Rethink those sorts of things against the backdrop of our legacy. And we've got to revamp our Victorian tax revenue and make it modern so that we don't have to extract cash or tax in the way we do. But we've still got to run our finances very conservatively. We've got to learn the lesson that we didn't learn over the last 5 years. And the last thing is that we've got to revise existing concepts of real estate use. If we cast our minds back to the Sonesta Beach property up at Southampton, I think most people think of that as tourist space. We've got to make a quantum leap and consider that as business park space. Morgan's Point is the one development I think that has great potential here because I see it as a base for business Bermuda. I don't really see it as adding much to our tourist product. Because the reality is that our tourist product is down to the point where we cannot get more than $70 million a year of tourism, but we've got to keep it alive in order to support international business. Our air arrivals are now under 200,000. Under 200,000. That's the ones who come in for leisure. The other 40,000 are business visitors. Business visitors make up a significant portion. So those are our midterm facts, and what we've got to do is do those things immediately, sort out our own attitudes, in the near term, education, long term, alter some of our rules and regulations. A quick point here, it's a funny one. Bermuda's very successful tourism industry was built on restrictions. Couldn't rent a car. Had to wear shorts of a certain length if you were female. Had to turn up in your hotel dining room with a jacket on. You couldn't do this, you couldn't do that, you couldn't put up signs, all sorts of restrictions, and it worked. We've still got the same attitude now in business Bermuda. It's not going to work the same way.